In a nutshell, the Egyptian state lacks the political will to allow for independent organizing and considers that those who are exposing human rights violations are a threat to national security. Torture, extrajudicial killings are systematic practices in Egypt as it constitutes an essential means of governance. So protests in Egypt are de facto banned. And since 2013, there has been a series of laws that were amended or adopted to criminalize the work of civil society actors and any peaceful form of expression and civic space. Egypt is now one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world, and the internet is the only place left where independent reported media information can be circulated, and the authorities continue to block at least 600 websites in Egypt, including news outlets and human rights organizations. Anyone who is defending or promoting human rights or challenging or voicing criticism, whether to the political or economic or social conditions, they can face arbitrary arrests, detention, enforced disappearances, torture and ill treatment, judicial harassment, travel bans. We have tens of thousands of persons arbitrarily detained, and this includes prolonged periods of pretrial detention. And those who get sentenced to very harsh sentences without any fair trials. And there is also denial of family visits and legal consultations and denial of medical care, which has in fact contributed to the death of many prisoners. So Egypt has shown no genuine will to acknowledge, let alone address, the country's deep-rooted human rights crisis. In the middle of the past decade, the state undertook profound social and economic changes in the country in an atmosphere that did not allow enough space for societal dialogue on these policies. Now, environmental and human rights groups have raised concerns about the limiting of protests to designated areas, about the ability of Egyptian civil society to meaningfully participate in COP without fear of reprisals. The Egyptian Fund for Human Rights, a local Egyptian NGO, reported that Egyptian authorities have disappeared and detained an Egyptian for joining a Facebook group calling for demonstrations on 11th of November under the title Climate Revolution around COP27 in Egypt. So 12 Egyptian human rights organizations have led and launched an open petition, which is so far supported by over 500 organizations, groups, and individuals from across the world. The petition calls on the Egyptian authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all of those detained simply for peacefully exercising their human rights, implementing the criteria set by local NGOs for these releases, which are fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, and urgency. It also calls on the Egyptian authorities to immediately end the arbitrary blocking of websites and to immediately release all journalists and end restrictions on media and digital spheres, to end the prosecution of civil society activists and organizations and guarantee space for civil society, including human rights defenders, to work without fear of intimidation, harassment, arrest, detention, or any other form of reprisal, and to ensure that civil society organizations, activists, and communities can meaningfully participate in all discussions and activities on climate and just transition policy development and implementation at all levels of decision-making without fear of reprisals. So to sign the petition, which is on copcivicspace.net, you can also take action in solidarity with Egypt Prisoners of Conscience by organizing awareness events, organizing or joining protests in front of the Egyptian embassies, and supporting the online campaigning by the Egyptian human rights movement, calling on Egyptian authorities to release detainees.